Jessica Moore glanced at the clock on her dashboard. It was past 10 in the evening, and she still had a 30-minute drive before she reached home. Her office was 50 miles behind her, where she had spent the afternoon poring over witness statements and legal briefs. Every part of her body felt tired, but her mind was still restless. As the state attorney, she carried the weight of many lives in her decisions, and tonight she replayed a tricky argument from earlier in court. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of black glass, broken only by the yellow line glowing faintly. In the beam of her headlights, outside, the air felt cool and quiet. Crickets sang somewhere in the fields beyond the trees, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead. The road was almost empty, a two-lane trail through farmland where streetlights were few and far between. Jessica kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, letting her thoughts drift between the day's cases and the grocery list she would have to make tomorrow morning. As she drove on, she reached over and adjusted the car radio, settling on a calm news podcast. The gentle voice of the anchor reminded her that, even late at night, there was a world of stories unfolding elsewhere. She sipped water from a bottle in the Q folder and looked out at the dark fields on either side, broken by occasional barns and silos standing like silent sentinels. Her phone lay face up on the passenger seat, its screen dimmed after a flurry of late emails. She felt a moment of relief to be away from the office lights and the buzz of staff conversation. The hum of her engine was a familiar friend by now, and she welcomed the solitude. It was in these quiet moments that she felt most grounded, able to breathe deeply and remind herself that tomorrow held new challenges, but tonight was still hers. Without warning, a bright flash of blue and red light bloomed in her rearview mirror. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She quickly checked her mirrors again, wondering if she had missed another car coming too close behind her. Instead of another driver, she saw the unmistakable swirl of police lights cutting through the dark countryside. She blinked, thinking it must be a mistake. She was in the middle of nowhere, just her and a few fields for miles. Yet those lights came again, sharper now, reflecting off the curve of her trunk and the white stripes at the edge of the road. Jessica straightened in her seat, her mind racing through possibilities. She had obeyed every speed limit sign since leaving the courthouse. She had even been cautious in the well-lit parts of town. Why was she being pulled over here on this lonely stretch of highway? She eased the car to the right shoulder, her pulse quickening. The pavement edge was rough and gravelly, but she found a small patch of smoother ground to park. She turned off the engine. The sudden absence of that steady hum felt oddly loud in the still night. For a moment, she sat perfectly still, hands resting lightly on the wheel, listening for any sound beyond the chirping crickets and the faint rustle of wind in the trees. In her mind, she rehearsed the polite greeting she would offer. She told herself to stay calm, to be clear and respectful, and to explain who she was if it became necessary. After all, she had worked hard for her position as state attorney, believed that honesty and cooperation were the best way to handle any encounter with law enforcement. A low rumble broke the silence as the patrol car drew closer. Its engine idled as it parked just behind her, the door on the driver's side opening with a soft click. Jessica took a slow breath, unfastened her seatbelt, and reached for her license and registration, which lay neatly in the center console. She moved carefully, so as not to appear startled or hurried. The red and blue lights painted the inside of her car in shifting patterns, making the dashboard instruments look as if they were dancing. Her mind repeated, "Be polite, be calm, be cooperative." She opened her door and stepped onto the gravel, feeling the small stones shift under her shoe. Night air brushed against her face, cool and slightly damp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Two officers in dark uniforms approached her window. The taller one carried a flashlight and held it casually by his side, while the other stood a little behind, his posture rigid. Jessica lifted her chin in greeting, smiling gently. "Good evening, officers," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Is there a problem?" The taller officer shone the flashlight into her eyes, and she noticed a flicker of annoyance in his expression. She wondered if he was impatient to get back to his car, or if he thought she had done something wrong. She handed him her license and registration without hesitation, keeping her other hand visible on the steering wheel at first, before moving it to rest comfortably at her side. The light from the flashlight was too bright, and Jessica blinked. A couple of times, she held out her documents, watching the beam dance over her hands. "I'm the state attorney," she added quietly, hoping to clear any confusion right away. "I've just come from the courthouse." The officer raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching as if he was amused. He took her documents and tucked them into a leather folder, still shining the light over her face as though he expected to find something suspicious. Jessica pressed her lips together to keep from saying more. In that moment, she felt a quiet anger rise inside her, but she held it back. She reminded herself that losing her temper would not help. She focused instead on breathing slowly, keeping her tone calm, her posture respectful. While she waited, she glanced at her phone, which lay on the passenger seat. She considered grabbing it, but the officers often saw that as an aggressive move. She forced herself to breathe evenly and to think about the next right step. She would stay calm, she promised herself, and if she needed to, she would show her badge. She trusted that. Her role as state attorney carried weight, and she believed the law should protect her, even on a lonely road at night. Yet part of her wondered, did the color of her skin matter more than the badge she carried? That question was painful, and she forced herself to set it aside, at least until she knew what the officers would say. The taller officer took a step back, closed his folder, and looked at her. He cleared his throat, glanced at his partner, and turned briefly to speak to him. Jessica stiffened. She tried not to listen, but their quiet words carried across the few feet between them. She thought she heard the word lawyer. She wondered if he realized she was not just any lawyer, but the chief prosecutor for the whole county. Her heart pounded in her ears. She had prepared for tough opponents in court, but this felt different. It was personal and unexpected. The two officers moved together, their steps measured. Jessica felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Slowly, she reached inside her jacket for her badge, planning to place it where they could see it without alarming them. In the hush of that night, under the shifting beams of red and blue light, Jessica Moore stood alone on the side of the highway. She felt exposed, even though she had done nothing wrong. She scanned the empty road behind her, wishing for another car to break the tension, to remind her that this stretch of highway was still just a normal road, but there was no one else. Only the officers, their uniforms, and their questions. Jessica squared her shoulders. She would face this like she faced every challenge, with calm determination and clear purpose. She waited for them to call her name or tell her what happened next, her hand hovering over the badge in her pocket the night. Pressing in around her in a mix of fear and resolve, she felt the night air press against her skin as she stood beside her car, waiting for the officers to speak. The taller one cleared his throat and took a slow step forward. His flashlight beams swung from her eyes to her hands and back again. She kept her hands where he could see them, fingers relaxed against her sides. He held out his notebook and pen, as though inviting her to confess some crime she did not know she had committed. Jessica opened her mouth, letting politeness guide her words. "I'm sorry, officer," she said in a clear voice. "Can you tell me why I'm being stopped?" Her heart tapped inside her chest like a timid drum, but her voice did not shake. The officer glanced at his partner, who stood stiffly a few feet behind him. Neither of them seemed eager to answer. He flipped through pages of his notebook before looking back at her. "You were driving in the dark on this road," he said. "Were checking for any suspicious activity?" He spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a small child. Jessica forced herself not to bristle at the tone. She breathed in and out, steadying herself. "I understand," she replied. "It is late. I'm simply on my way home from work." She gestured toward her sedan. "I've been at the courthouse since early this morning." She paused, giving him space to reply. Instead, the shorter officer moved closer, his arms crossed over his chest. He peered down at her with cold curiosity. The taller one tapped his flashlight against his palm. "Identification," he said. Jessica reached into her jacket pocket, feeling her badge rest against her palm. She decided to hold off showing it until he asked for more proof of who she was. She handed him her driver's license first, then gently placed her registration. On top, he studied the license under his flashlight. State of Brookwood, he read aloud. Jessica Moore. Name sounded heavy in the night air. The officer frowned and tapped his notebook. He looked at her car, then back at her eyes, as if he doubted the papers in his hand. She noticed the shadow of judgment behind his gaze. It felt like he saw her as suspicious before he even knew her name. She kept her expression calm. She forced herself to think of her morning court session, of the families depending on her. She refused to let this moment shake her. After a long pause, the taller officer lowered his flashlight. "Where have you been this evening?" he asked. His voice held a hint of disbelief, as though the idea of a lawyer on a lonely road after 10 o'clock did not make sense. Jessica met his eyes firmly. "I was at the courthouse," she repeated. "I was handling a sensitive case. I left once everything was done, and I'm heading home." She glanced at her watch to signal that time was passing. The officer tapped his notebook again, as though her answer did not satisfy him. He looked at his partner, and they exchanged a brief, unreadable glance. The shorter officer uncrossed his arms and leaned against the patrol car, the metal cold beneath his elbow. He seemed to study her face like she was an experiment. Jessica wondered what thoughts flickered behind his eyes. Did he think she was lying? Did her skin color matter more than her credentials? The questions swirled inside her, yet she kept her posture straight. She spoke again, softer this time. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm happy to answer any questions you have." She offered a small, polite smile. The officers did not smile back. Instead, the taller one gave a curt nod and motioned toward her car door. "Step back in your vehicle," he said. His tone left no room for argument. Jessica paused for a heartbeat, then obeyed. She closed the door gently behind her and settled into the driver's seat. The seatbelt clicked into place. She rested, her hands on the wheel, palms up in an open gesture. She remembered her training. Always keep your hands visible. Always stay calm. Always follow their instructions. She took a deep breath and glanced at her phone. It lay untouched on the passenger seat. She resisted the urge to grab it. Instead, she waited. She watched the door of her car frame her view of the two officers. The taller officer approached her window once more. He tapped on the glass with the flashlight. Jessica rolled it down halfway. The beam of light cut across her face, making her eyes squint. He leaned in close, his breath misting in the cool air. He asked again, "What were you doing before you left the courthouse?" Jessica spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "I was reviewing paperwork for my next trial. I finished around 8. I had to meet with a witness earlier, which delayed me." She gave him a brief summary of her afternoon schedule. She spoke with honesty and clarity. She watched his expression, hoping for some sign of understanding. Instead, he seemed to grow more suspicious. He sniffed, as if he doubted her words. "Witness, huh?" he muttered. The shorter officer chuckled quietly behind him. Jessica felt a wave of frustration, but she swallowed it down. She reminded herself that she had the law on her side. She reminded herself that her role demanded patience. She relaxed her shoulders and met his gaze. "Yes," she said, "a key witness." It was an important meeting. Her voice held quiet. Confidence. She held her breath, waiting for his next move. For a long moment, there was only the hum of the patrol car's engine and the whisper of the wind. Then the taller officer straightened and took a step back. He glanced at his partner, then down at her license and registration once more. "Your license checks out," he said finally. "No warrants." Jessica felt the tension ease slightly. In her chest, she gave the officer a small nod of thanks. She watched him tuck the papers back into his notebook. Her hands inched closer to the steering wheel, ready for whatever might come next. The shorter officer tapped his boot against the gravel, as if deciding whether to leave or prolong the moment. Jessica looked straight ahead, keeping her focus on the road. She noticed the yellow line stretching out, a faint promise that this interaction could end soon. She reminded herself that she was more than just a driver pulled over at night. Was the state attorney? She took a steadying breath. Whether they treated her fairly or not, she would handle this with grace. She would use her voice if she needed to. But for now, she would wait for them to finish. At last, the taller officer cleared his throat. He fixed her with a final look. "You can go," he said. The word sounded sudden, as if he had decided. To end this game, Jessica blinked, surprised by how quickly it shifted. She watched him turn and walk back to the patrol car. She waited until the driver's side door clicked shut before she rolled up her window. She exhaled a breath she did not realize she was holding. She leaned back in her seat, her heart still pounding but her mind clearer. She started the engine again, the hum returning to break the silence. The patrol car's lights followed her. For a moment before the red and blue glow receded in her rearview mirror, Jessica watched until the lights were gone. Then she took a deep breath, focusing on the yellow line ahead. She gently shifted into drive and eased back onto the highway. The wind whispered past her as she drove away. She glanced in the mirror one last time, seeing only empty road behind her. Her mind replayed the words of the taller officer, "You can go." She whispered them softly to herself, part relief and part wonder at how quickly their attitude had shifted. As she drove on, she felt a mix of emotions: relief that she could continue home, frustration that she had been treated with suspicion, pain that her skin color had made her guilty until proven innocent. She reminded herself that this was simply one moment in a long career. She told herself she would turn this into something positive. She would use her experience to push for better training, for empathy, and for fairness in every traffic stop. She told herself she would remember the cold beam of the flashlight and the harsh words so she could work to change them. And so she eased forward into the night, determined that her next steps would matter not just for her, but for everyone who faced the road in the dark. She sat in her car with the engine off, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The red and blue lights outside painted her dashboard in restless stripes. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat echoing in the quiet of the night. The officer tapped on her window again, the sharp rap of his flashlight against the glass, snapping her back to the moment. She rolled her window down a few inches, careful not to lean out or make any sudden moves. His face filled. The small gap, his eyes bright with that hard, searching look. He shone the flashlight into her eyes and she blinked against the glare. She kept her breathing steady. "Why were you speeding?" he demanded. Jessica's mouth tightened. She had not been speeding. She answered in a calm tone, "I wasn't speeding, officer. I was keeping to the limit." He frowned as if her words were a puzzle he could not solve. He leaned closer, his voice low. "Then why won't you admit you were going too fast?" She drew in a quiet breath and said, "I promise I was within the posted limits." She gestured gently with one hand to the speedometer still lit by the patrol lights. He waved the idea away. "Maybe you think you're above the rules," he muttered, stepping back but keeping his eyes locked on her. She forced herself not to shrink back. She reminded herself, "Stay calm. Speak clearly." She reached slowly into her jacket pocket and pulled out her badge. She placed it on the dashboard where he could see it without bending too low. The metal caught the flashlight beam and flashed sharply. "State Attorney Jessica Moore," she said softly. For a moment, his eyes flicked to the badge, surprise crossing his face. Then he looked back at her with a thin smile. "We've seen plenty of lawyers, ma'am," he said. "That doesn't mean you get to break the law." Jessica closed her eyes for a second. She felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She planted her feet firmly on the floor and met his gaze again. "I understand," she said. "I'm here to cooperate." She reached calmly across the console and lifted her phone off the seat so it rested in her palm. The officer's face went cold. "Put that down," he ordered, voice sharper this time. "Do not make any calls." She laid the phone gently back on the seat, careful not to push it or let it slip. "Of course," she said. She reminded herself again to keep her hands visible and her tone respectful. The shorter officer, who had been standing behind his partner, stepped forward now. He folded his arms and arched an eyebrow. "What's on that phone?" he asked. Jessica shook her head. "Nothing but messages I need for the morning," she said. She thought of the witness notes she had saved, the files she needed for tomorrow's trial, but she kept her answer brief. The taller officer shone the flashlight back in her face, and she closed her eyes against it. When she opened them, she saw his lips pressed in a hard line. He bent down and peered at her hands. "Keep them where I can see them," he said. Jessica spread her hands on the wheel. She counted the seconds as the beam moved back to his face. She felt sweat prick at her temples despite the cool night air. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as well. He'd straightened up and took a step back. "You live around here?" he asked bluntly. She shook her head. "No, officer. I live in town, about an hour from here." She pointed toward the east, where the faint glow of the city lights glimmered beyond the trees. He looked that way for a moment, then turned back to her. "Why are you on this road so late?" he pressed. Jessica hesitated. She thought of telling him everything. The long hours at the courthouse, the meeting with the witness, the endless paperwork waiting on her desk, but she kept it short. "I was working late at the courthouse. I'm on my way home." He narrowed his eyes, skepticism heavy in his tone. "A lawyer, huh? All work and no play?" He laughed softly at his own words. The shorter officer chuckled. Too, Jessica felt a sting, as if their laughter was a judgment on her very presence there. She swallowed hard. She would not let them shame her. She spoke again, quieter this time. "I take my work seriously," was handling a sensitive case. She hoped her sincerity would show in her voice. He crossed his arms and studied her face. "Sensitive case," he echoed. "You expect me to believe that?" Jessica's throat went dry. She took a steadying breath before answering. "Yes, I do. I'm happy to show you any documents you need in the morning." She gently tapped the folder of papers she had left. "In the passenger seat?" He raised his flashlight and shone it on the folder, then on her face, as if comparing the two. The seconds dragged on, heavy and slow. Jessica felt her muscles tighten. She fought the urge to tremble. She remembered what her mentor had told her. Treat every encounter as if the whole world is watching. Act with dignity, no matter what. She pictured herself standing tall in court, and she drew that strength into her spine. She straightened her shoulders and met the officer's gaze squarely. Finally, he lowered his flashlight. "All right," he said, voice tight. "Stay here." He took a few steps back and spoke quietly to his partner. Jessica listened for their words, but only caught bits. Special treatment, state attorney. Night patrol. She felt a surge of anger and a flash of hurt. Did they think her badge meant she was above the law? Or did they see her as a threat? She squeezed her hands into fists for a moment, then forced them open again. She would not give them any reason to tighten their hold. She cleared her throat softly and waited. The tall officer stepped back to the cruiser and opened the door. The engine rumbled to life, and the lights from inside splashed across her windshield. She watched as he leaned in, spoke into the radio, then paused and looked at her again. She couldn't hear what he said, but he seemed to be listening for a moment, like he was waiting for permission to end this. Jessica felt her pulse slow, slightly, as she realized how long she had held her breath. She realized, too, how powerless she felt in that moment. She was the state attorney, yet here she was, stuck in a car at night, under the hard light of strangers who judged her by how she looked. The cruiser's door slammed shut. The shorter officer came back to her side and knocked on the window again. She rolled it down. His face was unreadable in the half-dark. Said, "We're going to check those documents with dispatch." Is it tight? Jessica nodded once. "Of course," she said softly. She watched him walk back to the car, the hem of his uniform fluttering in the breeze. Alone again? She rested her forehead lightly against the steering wheel. The red and blue lights still danced outside, like flames licking at the edges of her calm. She closed her eyes for a second, willing herself to stay grounded, she thought. Of the people she represented, the families waiting for justice. She thought of tomorrow's sunrise and the chance to speak for those voices in court. She breathed in, then out. Then she opened her eyes and looked forward at the dark road. She told herself she would remember every detail of this night. Harsh light, the doubt in their voices, the weight of her own title. She would use it to push for change, for fairness, for kindness in moments of fear. She gripped the wheel a little tighter and waited for whatever came next. ChatGPT said she sensed the tension shift the moment she placed her badge on the dashboard. The metal glinted sharply in the patrol lights, and both officers froze where they stood. Jessica Moore watched as the taller one raised his flashlight. Just enough to illuminate the badge, his mouth parting in surprise. He took a step back, almost stumbling over the gravel. The shorter officer, who had been tapping his pen against his notebook, let it drop by his side, his eyes wide. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the police cruiser's engine and the distant chirp of crickets. Then the taller officer cleared his throat, his voice quieter, less harsh than before. "State Attorney," he said, repeating her title as if tasting it for the first time. He lowered the flashlight and let it rest against his chest, the beam no longer stabbing at her face. Jessica felt her own breath slow, the tight knot in her chest loosening just a little. She moved forward, keeping her hands clearly visible. "That's right," she said gently. "I'm Jessica Moore, the elected state attorney for this county. I wanted to cooperate fully with you, but I didn't want to assume my badge would matter if I flashed it too soon." Her voice was calm, caring, respectful. She felt an impulse to apologize, but she held that back. Instead, she let the officers gather themselves. The taller officer rubbed his forehead as if to clear his thoughts. He glanced at his partner, then back at Jessica. I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, stumbling over the formality of her title. His partner looked down, shifting uncomfortably. The apology sounded sincere, as if he realized he had let his own bias lead him to treat her roughly. Jessica nodded once, accepting the apology without gloating. She tucked her badge back into her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've had a long day at court. I understand you're doing your job, and I appreciate that. I just hope you'll treat everyone with the same courtesy you're showing me now." The taller officer's shoulders slumped. He looked away, scanning the empty road behind them. "Of course," he said quietly. We'll be more careful." He looked back at her, meeting her eyes. "You're free to go." Jessica exhaled without realizing she had been holding her breath. She thanked him and started the engine. The cruiser's lights went out almost instantly, leaving only the dim glow of her dashboard and the faint white lines of the road ahead. Now she watched the patrol car for a moment as it turned around and headed back the way she came. Its rhythm of red and blue now, a gentle blink in her rearview mirror. She leaned back in her seat, the leather cool against her back. Her heart still pounded, but she felt a wave of relief and quiet satisfaction wash over her. She reminded herself that relief was only the first step. She needed to use this moment to make a difference. When she reached home a little while later, her front porch light welcomed her like an old friend. Inside, she set her bag down and shut the door behind her, letting the click of the lock feel final. She kicked off her shoes and walked into the living room, where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light on the carpet. She sat on the edge of her sofa, her badge still in her pocket, and pulled out her phone. Her hands found the voicemail button before she could think. She left a message for her chief deputy. "We need to talk. I was pulled over by local patrol tonight on the highway. No good reason. Need to get that dash cam footage and file an official complaint. Let's meet first thing in the morning." She hung up and pressed her phone against her chest for a moment, feeling the steady beep of the recording indicator. Next, she opened her laptop at her desk and began drafting an email to the police chief. Her words were clear and firm, but measured. She described what happened, the questions she faced, and the moment when her badge changed everything. She asked for the dash cam and body cam videos and for a review of the stop to ensure that bias training and proper protocols were followed. While she typed, she thought back on the flash of the badge and the gratitude she felt when the officers finally listened. She also thought of the countless people without her title who did not have the luxury of being recognized. How many black drivers had felt that knot in their chest when the patrol lights flared up behind them? How many had feared for their lives before a badge could save them? She made a note in her draft. Propose a community outreach event with local law enforcement, an evening where citizens and officers could meet in a neutral space to share stories. She envisioned a town hall or simple gathering at the community center, maybe even a free dinner. It would be a first step toward breaking down the assumptions that had guided that stop. By midnight, she had a clear plan. She saved the email and closed her laptop. She sat in the quiet house for a moment longer, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. She felt tired but determined. The next morning, she arrived at the office early. Sunlight filled the hallway as she passed her assistant's desk. She greeted everyone with a warm smile, but her mind was on the meeting with her chief deputy. In the conference room, they watched the dashcam footage together, the harsh glare of the flashlight, the officer's words the moment they realized who she was. Her deputy took notes as she spoke, his brow furrowed in concern. "Yes, he," said when she finished her summary. "This needs to go to internal affairs. And training won't fix it alone. We should push for a third-party audit of all traffic stop data for bias." She nodded, appreciating his support. They outlined a strategy to approach the mayor and the police commission, to hold hearings and to involve community leaders. Before leaving that afternoon, Jessica stepped out to her car and eased in. She paused a moment, looking at the road that stretched out before her. She thought back to the long night before, the glare of those flashing lights, and the relief that came. Only when her badge turned suspicion into respect, she breathed in the warm air and exhaled slowly. She knew this incident would stick with her both, the fear and the power of that small piece of metal. She promised herself she would use her authority not for herself, but for everyone who did. Not have her title. She flashed her badge at herself in the mirror, almost as a reminder. It's not about the badge. It's about what you choose to do when you have it. Then she started the engine and drove away, already planning the next step. In her campaign for fair and respectful policing so that no one would have to wait for a badge to prove their humanity, she woke before dawn the next morning, her mind still humming with plans. The sky was pale when she arrived at the office, and the halls were quiet. She slipped into her chair and opened her laptop. First, she sent the email to the police chief, copying the internal affairs team and the mayor's office. Then she dialed her chief deputy and laid out the steps. Gather the dashcam and bodycam footage. Request all traffic stop records for the past year, and schedule a meeting with the police commission. By mid-morning, her inbox filled with acknowledgments and promises of swift action. While her staff sifted through reports, Jessica drafted a public statement. She wrote in simple, clear language about her traffic stop, without blaming the officers by name, but pointing out the harm that bias can cause. She called for transparency and accountability. She invited the community to join a fair policing workshop, where officers and citizens could speak openly. She hit send and felt the familiar rush of turning a personal ordeal into a chance for good. Later that day, she met with the chief of police in a small conference room. He was polite but guarded. Jessica showed him the footage, watching his face as the flashlight beam swept across her calm hands and face. He cleared his throat and admitted the stop had gone too far. He agreed to the internal review and to work with her office on bias awareness training. They shook hands on a plan to hold a joint press conference in 2 weeks. Over the next days, Jessica's office worked long hours to prepare the workshop. She enlisted a respected community leader to co-host and found a church hall that could hold up to 100 people. She printed simple flyers and posted them online. She spoke with local pastors, business owners, and youth groups, urging them to spread the word. She even drafted a short video message to explain why trust between police and citizens is so vital. The night of the event, Jessica stood in the hall's front doorway, greeting everyone as they arrived. She saw officers in neat uniforms shaking hands with neighbors they had never met before. She watched young people hesitate at first, then smile when an officer offered a quiet greeting. Inside, tables held refreshments and printed guides on rights during a traffic stop. A projector screen showed statistics on stops and searches, all prepared by her team in easy charts and clear text. She opened the workshop by sharing her own story, describing the long highway, the flashing lights, and the relief she felt when the badge finally spoke. There was silence, then gentle applause. Then a mother stood up and described how her teenage son trembled when he saw flashing lights. A retired teacher spoke of her fear during a stop last year. An officer admitted that he had never thought about how bias could influence his judgment. The room felt charged with honesty and hope. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to take root. The police department revised its stop procedures, requiring clear identification steps before any search. Officers completed a new training module on bias awareness. Jessica's office reviewed traffic stop data, and the police commission published a public report with findings and next steps. Community members formed a civilian oversight group to meet quarterly with department leaders. News outlets covered the story, praising the leadership shown by the state attorney and the willingness of the police to change. Jessica watched the reports with relief and a touch of pride. She knew the work was far from over, but she also knew that one honest meeting and one clear badge could spark a broader shift. She felt grateful for her role and committed to using it for others. Late one evening, Jessica sat at home and looked at the wall beside her desk, where she had tacked photos from the workshop. She saw officers and residents standing side by side, smiling. She thought of the long highway and the cold flashlight, and she felt how far they had come. She pressed her hand to her heart and whispered a quiet promise to keep pushing for respect, to keep listening to all voices, and to make sure no one would ever have to wait for a badge to prove their worth.